Edgeley University used to be a teacher training college for women. It was women-only entry, and people couldn't pick their courses like they could today. Looking into the Edge Hill archives, I'm able to read the Edge Hill College magazine, which started being published in 1892. And I can use the analyses of scholars such as Anne Laura Stoller and Rosalind O'Hanlon from the Oxford History of the British Empire to describe and analyze the words written in the Edge Hill College magazine to understand the thinking and the way people lived under colonial Britain from the point of view of patriarchy and gender. I was also able to look at the Guild Minutes in the Edge Hill archive, which detail the day-to-day activities and goings-on at Edge Hill University. So that will hopefully give us an emotional look at the way colonialism integrated itself within their day-to-day lives. Later, I'm also going to be able to interview the head of the archives, Dan Copley, to get his perspective on what it means to run the archives and what it tells us about the way people used to think in the past. In this context, we can look back at the Edge Hill College magazine, which was used by students who would travel abroad so they could write back to students at the university. The reason for this is described currently on the Edge Hill website as to learn about various parts of the world, which reflects an attitude towards education and a desire for objective truth which permeated the late 1800s and has persisted until our present day. One of these articles is entitled How to Dress in Bangkok and describes the fashion styles of the people in Bangkok compared to the Chinese and the people in the West. This is interesting to look at because even though its intended effect is to provide objective truth, it has many subjective generalizations within it. Could this be because knowledge and our search for objectivity is deeply ingrained within colonial ideology and practice? Hegel believes that myth and superstition used to be the basis of our storytelling, but with the coming of the Enlightenment and a search for scientific objective truth, that had to be replaced by reason. Stories have always been fundamental to the human race. The development of language being a significant evolutionary tool, as if two tribe members go and find a bear, and one of them is very normal around the bear, and another one starts kind of screaming and waving their arms, and that one gets eaten, the person that survived can then travel back to the tribe and tell the story of what happened, and they can then learn not to behave in the way that led to them being eaten. This can become extremely successful when objective truth is employed, as we can have much certainty as possible that this is really what happened. French philosopher Alain Badiou believes that knowledge is a static quality, in the sense that this is something that's perpetuated by the status quo. The government or the education system can keep this knowledge in public consciousness, and it ingrains itself within society and cannot change. He believes that truth, however, is separate from knowledge, and that is because this is when the status quo comes into question. The aim of this essay then is to highlight how the education system is implicated in colonial ideology using historic practice. The worldview of the people writing in How to Dress in Bangkok comes through clearly as these generalizations are made, and the people in Bangkok are seen as the other, while the people in Britain are seen as the norm. This comes through in the ethnocentric language used, such as the Far East. A prominent issue with history that's often discussed is that it is written by the victors. This is useful when it comes to a tribe member being eaten by a bear, but falls into question when oppression is introduced. A society that believes that killing and pillaging a village is the correct thing to do will be the ones that inevitably write about it. It can be argued that our modern society is combating this with their increased focus on objectivity and scientific truth. However, this desire for knowledge is often corrupted as it can be seen as a way to establish higher authority over a group of people. Perhaps the easiest way to see this in the flesh is within a British museum, as this is deeply implicated in colonialism itself. As Shahid Valda summarizes,
often thought of as integral institutions of progress, enlightenment and modernity, museums are deeply implicated in colonialism itself.
Ultimately, this essay will argue that education is fundamentally linked to colonialism, and then we can start to think about how we can move knowledge forward in search for truth.
Oh, oh, I'm falling in love. Oh no, I'm falling in love again. Oh, I'm falling in love. I thought the plane was going down. How'd you turn it right around? Oh, oh, I'm falling in love. Oh no, I'm falling in love again. Oh, I'm falling in love. I thought the plane was going down. How'd you turn it right around?
Thank you very much for joining us today. How would you describe your job at the Edge Hill Archives?
I'm the archivist of the Edge Hill Archives, which means I make sure that the records there are being preserved properly, looked after, and they're being made accessible to anyone who wants to come in and research things there.
That's great. So, what's the main thing you've learned about Edge Hill in its early years from looking at the archives?
I think the main thing I've learned is that there was a real variety of students there. There was a real quite a radical approach to education right from the early days. So being able to see that and learn about the lives of students and staff who worked there as well has been a real privilege really, and discovering the fact that there were so many people doing amazing things at the college, and that they were going out into the world and achieving some quite remarkable things.
Yeah, it certainly has a rich history.
It does.
So, what do you think the main difference in function of the university is from today, from when it started out?
I mean, the really obvious thing is that in those days, everyone was being trained to be teachers. So the college was entirely a college of education, and all of the students were women as well. So the first male students didn't arrive till 1959. So these were young women being trained to teach in the elementary schools. So education had changed a lot at that time. It was compulsory now for children to go to school, so there was a real demand for more and more teachers. And I think that you can also look at the fact that at that time there were changes in other areas of society. So by the late 19th century, we had what's now referred to as the first wave of feminism. So this is the early movements around what became part of the suffrage movement, so women campaigned to have the vote. And because women were being considered to be more important members of society, it was also felt that more women should be teachers because it gave positive role models to younger women coming through the time. So it was a really exciting time in a way for education, and Edge Hill was right at the heart of that, and was set up so that it could support people to become these teachers and really influence the next generation.
Yeah, it sounds like we wouldn't be here today without it, how it used to be, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, what do you think present students at the university gain by learning and thinking about the origin of the university and how it used to function?
I mean, I think it's really about them learning a few things really. I think one of the key things is a kind of pride in the fact that the past students did achieve so much, and that they were doing very radical things, and they were part of societal change. But also I think it shows this kind of almost like a continuum. You know, the students are part of a continuum. They're not just, you know, the students didn't just arrive here and then there wasn't generations before. There's been generations who've developed Edge Hill into the institution it is today, and that's not just because of the staff who've worked here. I think it's principally because of all the students who've been here since 1885, developing the culture that we all now work and study within.
Yeah. So why do you think many of the attitudes expressed back then now seem questionable and separate from today's attitudes?
Yeah, I think really a lot of it comes down to the fact that there was ignorance. The understanding of the world and the diversity of communities would have been quite limited to for some of the students then. So, you know, if you think about, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, most of the students would rarely have travelled beyond their immediate vicinity that they grew up in. They wouldn't have had as wide a knowledge of the world. So I think that's certainly a key factor. But I think we also have to put it into context of the time period in terms of education. So education was from a position of empire and of colonialism, and all of that was there, and it was something which our students were part of, whether they knew it or not. They were part of that system. So I think we can look back and see that the attitudes were different, and that for us can seem questionable at times, but I think those students were studying just within the world that they lived in, and they weren't really aware necessarily of the diversity of the world and the other communities that were out there.
From reading Edge Hill College magazine in the archives, I saw that there are some students that were able to travel abroad, and there's some that were taught in schools and things, in like English-speaking schools in Zimbabwe and such. So does it seem that Edge Hill had an abnormal amount of students and teachers that went to work abroad? And what do you think these accounts have to tell us about Britain as a whole at the time?
I don't know whether we had an abnormal amount. That's probably a question which I suppose someone who's studying research in terms of in other institutions of a similar time period would be able to support with that. I do think though that one key factor is that Edge Hill was, unlike other teacher training colleges at the time, Edge Hill was undenominational, which means that other teacher training colleges tended to be from an Anglican or Catholic perspective, and so their students came from those communities. Edge Hill being undenominational meant that the denominations that came to study here were from certain Christian denominations who at the time were very evangelical. Part of their mission was to go out and evangelise. So I'm talking about denominations like the Methodists in particular, Baptists, Presbyterians. So I think because those churches were quite relatively young churches at the time, sending their flock out as missionaries was perhaps quite common at that point. So they would have seen it as part of their Christian duty, and I suspect maybe that means that there was quite a lot at Edge Hill. Whether that's more than other institutions, I couldn't say for sure, but I'm sure that is partly why there is those denominations with that real radical spirit of going out and evangelising.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Visiting the archive, I was able to read through the Edge Hill College magazine and found certain articles from students writing back from abroad that displayed women's colonial thinking within the British Empire. Today, we will be looking at sections from the magazine that could be interpreted as colonial in essence, and discussing its implications. Analysing the way the students talked about these places and the people that lived there should help us to further understand the way they were thinking when living within colonial Britain. Many members of the Edge Hill Guild would provide articles for the magazine, especially ex-students, as it helped them maintain a relationship with the university, and old friends and teachers could have updates about their lives and stay in touch. Ex-student Kay Grindod focuses on fashion when writing about her trip to Bangkok, and it is here that certain assumptions about Siamese culture appear in her writing. Even the term Siamese itself is colonial in nature, as it originates from the European and Chinese traders' name for them, rather than the name they have given themselves, Thai. It derives from the Sanskrit meaning dark or brown, and can be seen as an outside judgment from people and not of their true essence. This mentality of othering ingrained itself within Western thought, meaning it can be observed within the article how people dress in Bangkok. This can be seen because generalizations are made about the people that live there, and how they act and the clothes they wear say about them. Strikingly, a smiling baby is described as a distinctly British attribute, and unusual when on the face of a Siamese baby. For example, she describes, looks up at one as freely and smiles as cordially as any young Britisher. This allows us to see how attributes that are observed as positive are seen as British, and any negative observations are strictly Siamese in nature. The main instance of this that takes place appears to be the assumption that the West are hard-working and productive, while the Siamese are lazy and incompetent. They are described as pleasure-loving, work-abhorring people, and the clothes are judged in a manner that backs this assumption up. As she states, "These are holiday, not workaday colours." She compares the same clothing that a Siamese wears and a French person wears, arguing there is a stark difference because of the person wearing it. She writes, "A hat that would be remarkable when worn by a fashionable lady in the Champs-Élysées, but is a thing to make one weep when on the head of a wee Siamese girl." This statement is interesting because it argues that the exact same hat has different values when worn by different people. Grindod claims that when the hat is worn by a high-class lady in Paris, it is remarkable. But when the same hat is worn by a Siamese girl, it is a thing to make one weep. This judgment appears to be given because the Siamese culture is seen as lazy and inferior when compared to the white man, as Grindod spells it out in her conclusion. It is a significant fact that the dress which suits all purposes, but has no claim to beauty, is that which is worn by the white man and the Chinese, the two races which side by side do all the work of brain and muscle in the Far East, all people else being as distinctly inferior in power as in adaptability of costume. While Britain did not directly colonize Thailand, it is clear that their authority was being established, as they were attempting to appear superior thanks to their power and work of brain and muscle. This assumption is far from the truth that is recognized today, as each culture, including that of the Thai society, are seen as powerful and significant, and to argue that one is more superior than the other would be seen not only as morally wrong, but also simply incorrect. While the article "How People Dress in Bangkok" is the focus of this essay, similar colonial attitudes can be found throughout the next few publications. For instance, in the next issue, Kay Grindod provides an update to her travels in Bangkok, but instead of the perspective of fashion, it is of nature. This article therefore provides less generalizations about Siamese culture, but nevertheless, a colonial ideology subtly persists throughout. There is a colonial tradition of discovery, which entailed the excitement and interest in nature that differed from that of the colonizer. The nature in Bangkok was seen as starkly different from that of Britain, so it was seen as something to observe and write back about. Professor of English at the University of Toronto, Alan Bewell, writes about the colonial romanticization that existed and the importance that was placed on discovering new natures that hadn't met Western eyes before. He then goes on to describe the categorizing that permeated Western science and disregarded the perspectives of the natives of the lands they were visiting, as names were changed, and there was a strong feeling that knowledge of an object meant that it was rightfully theirs, which led to the growth of museums in the West. While this article is not explicitly guilty of the wrongs caused by the compartmentalization of colonized cultures, the same dominant Western mindset is present. While there are many beautiful descriptions of nature, the attitude of documentation can be found through the many instances where flower and tree types are named and not merely described. It must be considered, however, that this is merely an effort to learn and provide information about a place, which is not inherently wrong. Despite this, there isn't much credence given to the perspectives of the native Siamese living there, or the Chinamen that are described to be working there. Instead, the decision the Siamese make to partake in beetle chewing is described as a vile habit, and their reasons for doing so are not considered, and the generalization is made that all of them participate. Again, the negative assumptions made by the West about Bangkok are made clear in the final few lines of the article, as they read, "The walk has wearied you. One is always very weary after very trifling exertion here, but you can walk in Bangkok, you see." This is because the beginning of the article depicts their assumptions of Bangkok being full of filth and depravity, and these expectations were subverted after a pleasant walk amongst nature. Therefore, even in the most unsuspecting of places, colonial attitudes of women in the late 1800s can be discovered, as assumptions are made in the Edgehill College magazine that illustrate the Western mindset of superiority amongst the more general curiosity about exotic places and different cultures. Furthermore, colonial attitudes are made more explicit in the 9th issue of the magazine, in which M. Finley describes life on the Karoo. This was written in the year 1900, showing that these attitudes continued into the 20th century. While the article is focused on life in South Africa, such as the wildlife, significant time is given to describing the natives in a negative light. Previously established colonial stereotypes of the natives in South Africa being savage thieves is reinforced. As Finley describes, now the Cape native will steal anything under the sun, before describing safe correspondence as more important than their lives. But he has a wholesome fear that the moment he touches a post bag, that moment will be his last, and so correspondence is safe on the high road. This reads as though a threat is being directed at the natives, and violence is used against them if they get out of hand, even though it is their land, and the colonizers are really visitors. There is also evidence that not only violence was used, but they attempted to establish English culture amongst the natives. It is rather startling at first to hear a coloured nurse singing "God Save the Queen" to her charge in excellent tune. It is true that Finley acts surprised to hear the nurse sing as such, though it must have been the British that taught her the song. The teaching of such a song could be seen as an attempt to spread British influence and power around the globe, which was the core goal of colonial ideology. The article goes on to use and discuss the term colonial itself, and so we get a greater picture of what it meant to women at the time and how it was justified. She writes, "Hospitality is one of the ingrained virtues of the colonial," explaining that the colonizer are providing hospitality, and so they are providing a good to South Africa. As Camilla Boysen from the University of Johannesburg points out, colonialism was often justified with the claim that the British were the civilized and they had a moral obligation to help the uncivilized. This could mean, then, that the virtue of hospitality was seen as a gift that they were able to provide the uncivilized natives. However, this kind of justification did not always need to be used, as they often took their presence there for granted, as seen towards the end of the article, when it explicitly describes a colonial's comments when returning to South Africa. Said a colonial who recently returned from England, where he had intended to spend the remainder of his days, "It's no use. I'm very fond of the old country and all that, but man, I couldn't breathe there. There wasn't any room there." This reflects an attitude that this new land belonged to them, and they could live there as long as it suited them. South Africa perhaps had less people and more open space than England, and so this colonial felt more comfortable there, and so there he went. Therefore, explicit colonial attitudes can be found throughout the Edgehill College magazine all the way into the 1900s, and the attitudes of women at this time within this society differ from what would be considered appropriate today. This can be found through the limited consideration of the experiences of the people that originated on the land in their writings, and the use of colonial justifications throughout, that do not hold up to scrutiny in the 21st century. Finally, the description of Annie Williams's work in a missionary school in Assam and the provided letters from her supply an insight into the ways in which a colonial mindset operated within education, particularly from the perspective of female teachers in the late 19th century. She is described to have been working at a mission school during the day and doing missionary work in the evenings, in the weeks leading up to her unfortunate sudden death of cholera. Many good deeds are described to have been committed by Miss Williams, and it appears as though she wholly had good intentions. However, there are certain aspects of her letters that carry a degree of Western superiority that would be questioned today. She talks of trying to teach them to leave in an orderly way, insinuating that their natural behavior is of disorder and disarray. There appears to be the idea that they need to be changed in order to improve, and this is justified as the English know the best way to behave. While the majority of schools around the world demand behavior to be orderly, it must be considered who are deciding the rules and the motive behind them. It could be argued that it would benefit to have some order in a missionary school, but there may be certain parts of society in Assam that don't abide by English standards. Therefore, we see here that the mindset that English society should dominate, as it was the superior one ingrained within Western ideology and practice, finding its way into the lives of female teachers in the late 1800s. It seems, then, that the colonial way of thinking was so embedded in Western society that its order was enforced often without much thought put into the reality behind what was going on. Miss Williams rarely seems to consider an alternate way of living, as the colonial worldview was all she knew. Therefore, from analysing the words in the Edgehill College magazine, it must be concluded that within British life there was a significant amount of colonial ideology and prejudices that seeped into the everyday thoughts and practices of female university students and teachers. These students will have been some of the most educated in the country, as university, especially for women, was not as common as it is now, and women scholars were often criticized by men. Due to this, they were likely well read and were given rare opportunities such as travels to Bangkok and missionary service in Assam, which they were able to write back about. They will have been able to learn about the places they visited from their reading of similar articles and Western documents, perpetuating the colonial ideas that reflected in the prejudices in their writings. For example, when K. Grindod wrote of Bangkok, it was from the lens of Western clothing demonstrating their established virtues of hard work and progress, while the clothing of the Thai was seen as demonstrating their established vices of laziness and procrastination. M. Finley's account of life on the Karoo describes hospitality as strictly a Western virtue that the natives of South Africa should be grateful to them for providing. Finally, A. Williams creates the atmosphere in her writing that the disorderly children of Assam need to be taught how to be orderly by the teachers from England in the missionary school, which was likely established to spread Western religion. All these points of view, from a clearly Western colonial mindset, probably didn't get a second thought when they were published in the late 1800s, but today are clearly products of their time. This can be observed on the Edgehill Archive website, as the issues in question are given a content warning for readers of today, which reads, "As an historical resource, the content of this magazine reflects the language and thinking of the era in which it was created, and can include language and imagery which is offensive, oppressive, and may cause upsets." It is clear, then, that these magazines give us an insight into a worldview and way of thinking completely different from our own. However, it must be considered that the way of thinking has brought us to the worldview we share today. It is clear from these magazines that colonial ideology has ingrained itself into academic life, so therefore there may be roots of colonialism that have perpetuated through time that little thought is given to today. To conclude, the Edgehill College magazine provides insight to aspects of life that were intrinsically colonial and opens up room for discussion surrounding what prejudices may persist to this day. It shows the justifications used by educated women in the West in the late 1800s for colonial ideology and actions, prompting us to think about what narratives we may be using today to shape reality that have either permeated through the education system or passed on another way. To conclude, the articles in Edgehill College magazine represent a worldview and discuss values that are considered out of date or even offensive in the modern context they are being viewed in today. As a result, the Edgehill Archives have had to leave a content warning which reads, "As an historical resource, the content of this magazine reflects the language and thinking of the era in which it was created, and can include language and imagery which is offensive and may cause upset. These ideas are not condoned by Edgehill University, but we are committed to providing access to this material as evidence of the inequalities and attitudes at the time period." However, at the time of publication, there was no such consideration that the words written there may cause harm and upset, as they were operating under a completely different time and context. Each analysis made has to be from the context and perspective and time and place it was written, meaning the comments made here are restricted to the worldview of a student at Edgehill University in 2025, and to somebody within a different time and context, it may appear just as flawed as the articles from the late 19th century that are being analysed. Despite this does not make the words they used any less harmful, and it could be argued that our ability to recognise this today is a sign of progress and a step in the right direction. It is important to consider then the aspects of the growth of education that fosters a fairer, decolonised system that adapts people's needs rather than perpetuating the biases of old. In the book Ways of Knowing by Jonathan W. Moses and Bjorn L. Knutson, the differences between naturalism and constructivism are highlighted. When looking at history, for example, the approach of a constructivist may be more infallible than that of a naturalist, as it accepts that historical analysis always exists within the perspective of the historian. E.H. Carr explains the belief in a hard core of historical fact existing objectively and independently of the interpretation of the historian is a preposterous fallacy, but one which is very hard to eradicate. This information is well presented in the video essay, How Can Burns Change the Way We Look at History by Like Stories of Old, which is worth watching for more information. As a naturalist historian is criticised for these reasons, as the assumption often made that an objective categorisation of history can be obtained, and so constructivism is suggested in its place. The acquiring of knowledge within the articles looked at in the Edgehill College magazine can arguably suffer for these reasons, as they often are using their worldview as the objective truth in which to analyse their data, even when surrounded by people with opposing perspectives. Within history, it is important to remember that data that can be looked at in the past is only a small percentage of the full picture, as it has to have been something that was observed and then remembered as it happened, recorded in some way, and then survived the passage of time before being subjectively chosen by a historian for use in their overall thesis. Therein lies a similar issue with the ethnocentrism presented in the articles written under Empire in the Edgehill College magazine, as there was a lack of consideration that only a tiny portion of cultures and places were observed, and that an even smaller portion of that was chosen to be used in the narrative presented in the article. So while it can be argued that progress has been made, as articles establishing British superiority over other cultures is much less common, there is much to be learned from the constructivist approach and the pitfalls of naturalism when attempting to overcome the perpetuated biases presented by the society the writer is operating within. A long time ago, the way humans tell the objective truth through stories and historical analysis went wrong, as it was channeled through the subjective views of the recounter, which are full of biases and countless evils. Therefore, it seems that a wider, more considerate view of history and the world can be obtained when empathy is increased. This would mean that when observing a written account or historical analysis, it is important to consider each individual subject being described. Would they wish to be portrayed in this manner? What has led to the situation that they are in? It must also be important to remember that all you can really know is the worldview you are experiencing. But a powerful attribute would be to be open-minded enough to take in and learn about alternate experiences and perspectives. For example, escaping from your iron dome and reading from the voice of a colonizer, but then also reading from the colonized, will provide a more colourful view of history than just focusing on the perspective of one person. Now, more than ever, it is important to listen to the voices of minorities, as they are the ones who have been silent for so many years. This can be a daunting task, but so much hidden magic and beauty can be found when instead of shutting yourself into one perspective, you consider the lives of every single individual, the different places they are from, their different parents, their different friends, their different enemies, their different lovers, and their different motives. This entails realizing that not all there is purely your own sphere of subjectivity, but wider spheres of truth, from what we can encounter to what has survived, what has been recorded, what has been remembered, and what has been observed, to the complete, undefinable, unexperienceable past.